What if someone could walk out of your life in minutes and leave you carrying the consequences forever? I was 26 the night my sister came to my apartment. It was late. I remember because I had already turned off the lights when I heard the knock. When I opened the door, she stood there with a suitcase in her hand. She didn't step inside. She didn't ask how I was doing. She looked like someone waiting to be excused, not welcomed. Her 10-year-old son was already there. He was lying on my couch, burning with fever. His breathing was shallow and uneven, like each breath took effort. Doctors had warned us before that his condition wasn't simple. Some days were manageable. Others could turn dangerous without warning. Seeing him like that made my stomach tighten. I asked her what was going on. She said she was leaving town. Not for work, not for help. For a man she'd met a few months earlier. A man who didn't want a sick child slowing things down. Before I could argue, my mind jumped ahead. Who would take him to appointments? Who would pay for medication? What would I even say if I had to take him to the hospital in the middle of the night? I told her I wasn't ready. I told her I didn't know how to take care of a sick child. I begged her to wait, just a few days, just until he was stable. She pulled her arm away and said the sentence that changed everything. "He's your responsibility now." Then she turned and left. The door closed and the apartment felt too quiet, too small. I stood there realizing I had just been handed something I hadn't agreed to and couldn't give back. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor beside the couch, watching his chest rise and fall. At one point, his fever spiked, and I picked up my phone to call emergency services, then froze. I didn't know if I was even allowed to make that decision. I lowered the phone and kept watching him breathe. At 3 a.m, I was counting minutes between doses, terrified I'd misread the instructions. When he woke up crying and asked for his mother, I lied. I told him she'd come back. The truth was, I barely knew how to manage my own life. I had no plan, no preparation, no safety net. But one thing was clear. If I walked away, no one would stop me. And that scared me more than staying. What I didn't understand yet was that staying wouldn't just cost me sleep. It would slowly pull me into systems and consequences I wasn't prepared to face. Have you ever helped someone long enough that it stopped being help and quietly became your job? By the second week, the shock wore off. What replaced it was logistics. Medication schedules taped to the fridge. Appointment cards stacked by the sink. A small notebook I carried everywhere because I was afraid my memory would fail before my body did. Times, dosages, symptoms, everything written down just in case. Phone calls started coming in. "I'm calling about your son." I corrected them every time. "I'm his aunt, not his parent." There was always a pause, not confusion, adjustment. Then the conversation continued as if the correction didn't matter. That's when I learned how systems really work. Pharmacies didn't care why a child was with me. Hospitals didn't care who left. Schools didn't care about explanations. They cared about signatures, insurance numbers, and who could be held responsible if something went wrong. And without anyone saying it out loud, that became me. The first time it caused a problem was at the pharmacy. The prescription was ready, but the clerk asked for authorization I didn't have. She lowered her voice and said, "We'll need the legal guardian for this." I stood there holding a sick child's hand, realizing I was responsible enough to be blamed, but not enough to decide. Work started slipping, not dramatically. A morning appointment that ran long. An early pickup I couldn't avoid. Sick days turned into vacation days. Conversations shifted from concern to policy language. Flexibility started coming with conditions. At night after he slept, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork written as if this had been my plan all along. I tried calling my sister. Once, then again, then weeks later. Straight to voicemail. Her life kept moving. Mine narrowed. The line I crossed didn't feel dramatic. A doctor slid a clipboard toward me. "We'll list you as the primary contact." I hesitated. Then I signed. That was the moment I stopped filling in. I became the plan. And once responsibility landed on me, the questions stopped being about care and started shifting toward records, decisions, and whether I'd done enough. Have you ever noticed how quickly concern turns into scrutiny once people decide you're responsible? It didn't happen all at once. No one confronted me. No one raised their voice. The shift was quieter than that. Doctors began explaining things more slowly now, but not more kindly, more carefully. The tone changed from reassurance to precision, like every word was being chosen for a reason. Teachers stopped asking how he was adjusting and started asking whether I felt fully prepared to manage everything. Even friends changed. "You're doing great," they'd say. Then, after a pause, "But this is a lot." The first time something went wrong, a reaction no one could have predicted, the room didn't fill with urgency. It filled with attention. Questions followed. Not angry ones, structured ones. "Did you notice the symptoms earlier? Were the instructions followed exactly? Can you walk us through your decision process?" I answered calmly, honestly, while a nurse stood nearby, writing as I spoke. Not aggressively, not secretly, just enough for me to notice. At the end, she slid the paper into the file and said, almost casually, "We'll document this and follow up." That was the moment the floor shifted. No one asked where his mother was. They already knew who was in charge. At work, the tone shifted too. I wasn't unreliable, but I was complicated. An email arrived asking me to attend a brief meeting with my supervisor and HR to review availability expectations. No accusation. No warning. Just language that felt heavier than it looked. Every explanation I gave started sounding like justification the moment it left my mouth. People stopped saying, "This shouldn't be on you," and started asking whether I'd explored other arrangements. Options that always involved someone else stepping in, someone who, conveniently, wasn't present. The worst part wasn't the blame. It was the doubt. I started replaying decisions at night, wondering if I'd signed something I shouldn't have. If staying had crossed a line that turned care into liability. That's when it became clear. When you stay long enough, people stop seeing you as help. They start seeing you as responsibility. And once responsibility exists, so does evaluation. The person who walked away faded into the background. The woman who stayed became the variable everything was measured against. And once things start getting written down, reviewed, and scheduled for follow-up, they don't just sit there. They start moving. Have you ever felt the moment when something stops being reviewed and starts being acted on? For me, it didn't come with an argument. It came with an email. The subject line was neutral. The language was polite. A request to attend a meeting. A few names CC'd that I didn't recognize. Words like routine, standard, follow-up used carefully as if nothing important was happening at all. By then, I knew better. The meeting wasn't about care. It was about alignment. Policies, procedures, risk, terms that sound harmless until you realize they're designed to decide who carries responsibility when something fails. They asked me to walk through timelines, decisions, documentation. I answered carefully, sticking to facts. I noticed how often phrases like best practice and standard protocol came up. How often my answers were written down instead of acknowledged. No one accused me of anything. They didn't need to. When the meeting ended, they said they'd review the information and follow up. No timeline, no reassurance, just motion. At work, the consequences showed up quietly. My schedule was adjusted temporarily. Flexibility became conditional. I was told the company needed predictability. The meeting with HR wasn't hostile, it was procedural. Notes were taken. Action items were listed. Nothing felt dramatic. Everything felt permanent. At home, the pressure sharpened. Appointments multiplied. Forms arrived with longer instructions. One letter referenced a review process I hadn't known existed. Another asked for documentation I didn't realize I was responsible for keeping. One night, sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by folders, I realized something that made my chest tighten. I wasn't being supported anymore. I was being assessed. Every decision I made now lived on paper. Every mistake, real or perceived, had a place to land. And if something went wrong, it wouldn't be seen as bad luck. It would be seen as failure. I thought back to the night my sister left, how easily everything had been placed in my hands, how little anyone had questioned it then. Now, everything I did was being questioned. The weight wasn't just heavy anymore, it was directional. Because once a system decides you're the responsible party, the next step isn't evaluation. It's deciding what to do with you. Have you ever waited so long for an outcome that you stop expecting it, until it arrives without warning. The decision didn't come with an explanation. It came with a meeting that had an agenda. Same building, same neutral tone. But this time, the room felt different. Documents were already laid out. Someone I hadn't seen before was present, introduced only by role. No small talk, no reassurance. They began with the record, dates, forms, notes. Every signature I had provided. Every decision I had been questioned about. The paper trail that had quietly followed me for months. Then one of them paused. "There's an inconsistency here," she said, tapping a page. "The point where responsibility shifted doesn't align with the original consent." The room changed. They asked me again when I became the primary contact. I answered the same way I always had. Then they asked who was responsible before that date. I said my sister's name. This time, it didn't disappear into the air. The questions turned, not toward me, away from me. They asked about abandonment, about lack of follow-up, about why responsibility had transferred without formal documentation or transition. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. By the end of the meeting, they told me they would be reaching out to her, not to discuss, to notify. At work, the meeting I'd been bracing for quietly vanished from my calendar. My schedule returned to what it had been before. No explanation, no apology, just a correction. A few days later, a letter arrived. Not an accusation, a determination. Responsibilities clarified, oversight reassigned. My role defined, limited, documented, protected. For the first time since my sister left, I wasn't carrying something that didn't legally belong to me. I didn't feel relieved the way I expected. I felt steady. The system hadn't rewarded me. It hadn't thanked me. It hadn't acknowledged the cost. It had simply stopped misplacing responsibility. That night, I sat at the same kitchen table where months earlier I'd been surrounded by folders and fear. The paperwork was still there, but it was finished. Staying hadn't made me invisible. It had made the truth unavoidable. Because sometimes, the only way responsibility ends up where it belongs is when the person who stayed long enough refuses to carry it forever.